Hello everybody, welcome back for another episode of the Stokes Sound Podcast. I'm your host Ed Stokes, and today we have special guest EDG Mixing all the way over from Nashville. How are you doing, man?
Yo, what's going on? Thank you for having me, man. How you doing?
Well, thank you so much for coming on. You are a super talented mixing engineer, so if you just want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, what you do, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so my name is Edoardo Ghigo. I go by EDG Mixing. I'm predominantly a mixing engineer. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, as of right now. I'm originally from Italy. I started off originally by DJing a little bit. My dad, back when he was probably like my age or maybe even in high school in Italy, he used to DJ like house parties and stuff. And that was loud. And he used to just have like his DJ equipment laying around all the time. He never took it too seriously, but then when we moved to America, he just like never got rid of it. So all this stuff was laying around the house and I started seeing it. I was like, okay, might as well mess around with it. When I got into high school, I probably started messing around with it a little bit because I figured I could DJ like school parties and high school dances that they have over here and stuff. So I started doing a little bit of that. My dad saw that I liked it, and he would like probably didn't know what to give me for Christmas or something, and got me Ableton Live. And that's when I started producing a little bit. I got into making beats that way. That was probably like my sophomore, maybe junior year of high school. Sophomore year of high school for sure. If not before that, maybe freshman. And then, I became very good friend with a guy who was actually super talented at like freestyling. We would just be like hanging out in the car, and he could just go on forever. And he was just at my house one day, and I was just playing him some beats, and I figured like, okay, nobody wants to sit in here and listen to my beats all day. I might as well figure out how to record. Figured out how to record him. Just made music with him all through high school. Then went off to college. I went to MTSU, Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, for my first 2 years for audio production. But I mostly just went there to get like all my general credits out of the way, and then transferred over to Belmont University for audio engineering and technology. That's my major, and then my minor is in music business, and I'm actually graduating here in May. So that's
fantastic.
Cool.
That sounds great.
I mean, when I was long story short, the way I got into mixing really was when I got to MTSU, I was pretty much just trying to work with everybody. By the time I left MTSU, or actually by the time COVID happened, I was pretty much producing for like everybody that made hip hop, rap, R&B, pop music in the school, or at least it's a huge school, so not everybody, but a lot of people in my circle I was producing for, and then I was just mixing for the people I was producing for and recording. COVID happened, we all got sent home. At least most people aren't from Murfreesboro, so they were either from Memphis or from other places, and I had to go back to West Virginia, where we moved to with my family when we came here from Italy. All my friends pretty much started hitting me up like, hey, I'm back here, I can't record, so I'm buying a little home setup. It works all right, but it sounds horrible. Can I just send you my stuff? And I was like, oh yeah, send it to me. I'll send it back. Did that a couple times, and then COVID ended up lasting way longer than we thought. And by the time COVID was like, it was probably like halfway through COVID, I was like getting a couple clients, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, this is something I could do. So yeah, I built it up from there. Then realized I wanted to try and push on social media. Did that and built it from there.
Yeah, so COVID changed everything then. Well, I mean, it changed it for everyone, but it kind of
quite
accelerated.
A negative thing, but it was positive in some sides.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I wanted to bring you on the show because, I've had some of the stuff, and I think you're a fantastic mixer, and I wanted to talk about in this episode kind of saturation. I mean, I know it will depend on genre of music,
sure.
But, if we go kind of from the very start, I mean, do you work mixing wise on lots of different genres, or do you have like your own kind of niche that you mainly dive into?
Yeah, so
usually?
I definitely would say most of my work does come from the hip hop rap scene, but that's only to a certain point, because then when I look at it, honestly, there's a lot of pop and a lot of R&B that I work on. Not a huge fan of that style of music, but I've done a couple like Christian records of people that have reached out to me. I've done, being in Nashville, I have gotten to work on some country, even if that's also not my favorite record. But I'll pretty much work on anything, honestly. Anything that I can feel like I have somewhat of a connection with the artist, or I just like the song, I'm down to work on it. But definitely hip hop and rap mostly.
Amazing. I mean, obviously Nashville's massive in country. So do you use your same kind of mixing techniques that you would do in hip hop in country because of your kind of hip hop influence?
I mean, there's like, I would say country and hip hop are probably like the complete different ends of genres. So you definitely got to approach it very differently. I would say, and I don't work on it a lot because again, like I gotta just be honest, country's not my favorite genre, and honestly, luckily Nashville's growing in pretty much every genre. Like people don't like to hear it, but country's definitely getting replaced in my opinion. Um, but no, I would say like in hip hop, it's definitely like fundamentals are like get the bass to sit where the artist wants it to, and just blow through the speakers, and then get the vocal nice and centered, and everything else just kind of stays to the sides, in my opinion. And with country, it's a lot more just like natural. Everything needs to be cohesive. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot more of like a cleaner sound. I can imagine there's a
Yeah,
lot more
sure.
saturation. I mean, whenever I'm doing hip hop, it's like a lot of saturation, a lot of
Yeah,
kind of distortion, parallel vocals, all of that kind of stuff. And
sure.
what kind of if we talk about kind of your mixing workflow and the way that you do it in the sense of saturation, do you find that you're doing a lot of parallel processing to achieve what you're wanting to achieve? I mean, feel free to kind of bring it back to basics and then forward on how you, I guess, do it, if that all
Sure.
makes
So I
sense.
think in general, even if I'm recording, I'm a big fan of saturation. I feel like I use it on pretty much everything. And if I'm recording, for example, I have access to a couple studios here in Nashville, and one of the studios that I'm at often is Ocean Way, and they have a SSL Origin board that I really like.
Nice.
And if I'm recording, which I don't do a lot of recording at all, but if I do, I like to like push the preamp a little bit more than I should, and then back down the small fader so it's going into Pro Tools, like not clipping. And that gives you like analog saturation, which is obviously very different from what we do when we create it in the box. So all the way from recording to I'm usually mixing and mastering if I'm working on something. So all the way to mastering, I usually have some type of saturation going on in each step. But I say they're used in very different ways for different meanings. Like I use parallel distortion on drums a lot, and that's more to get like aggressiveness. But then I feel like every time I'm using saturation on my mix bus or in mastering, it's not even to achieve a certain sound. It's most likely to like use the harmonics to get more loudness. Um, yeah,
Do
I
you
feel
have
like
any
if you
like
use
go?
too much saturation, you can, especially in today's records, you can end up changing the sound of the record too much, and some people that's not what they're looking for. So yeah, it's tricky, but I definitely feel like I use a lot of saturation, like in a lot of saturation with very low percentages in multiple different steps. I think is the best way to go about it.
Fantastic. And do you have any main saturation plugins that you tend to use all the time across most mixes, or do you
Uh,
try and change it up to keep it more interesting for
Besides
yourself?
the what's called Fat Filter Saturn 2, I feel like that's been on my mix bus for like every mix I did last year, probably. In all types of different ways, but I feel like it finds itself in there, its way in there somehow. Besides that, I try to switch it up. I really like the stock Pro Tools Lo-Fi. It's a stock Pro Tools plugin, and it sounds really good. I use it on 808s and stuff all the time. Very low percentages, barely hear it when I use it. And yeah, no, besides that, I try to be pretty experimental. There's new stuff coming out all the time. And I don't know, I feel like I'm honestly using like the same tools on like every single mix, but in different ways very
Yeah.
often. But at the same time, I do try to keep track of like stuff that's coming out and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many plugins these days, isn't it? You'd be there all day just trying out
Yeah.
new plugin after
Yeah, it's
new
crazy.
plugin. I find that I do that. Like Waves have another plugin out. I mean, the Waves BB Tube, I think I've been using lately. It's an amazing
Yeah.
plugin.
That's cool.
But
I'm between on my drum bus, I feel like I've been using that and the black box something from Plugin
Plugin
Alliance. I don't
Alliance,
remember.
yeah,
Yeah, that one. I've been using those two on my drum bus a lot. Shout out to Waves. I'm a Waves affiliate, so I definitely use their stuff a lot though.
yeah, fantastic. And do you find that you're doing a lot of saturation on effects, so like vocal reverbs, delays? Are you doing a lot of saturation on that as well
Mm,
as inserts? On the actual
Not a lot
tracks
of
or
it. I would say if I am doing it, I find myself somehow doing it before the effect. So I'll try to like, if I have, let's say, a really crazy, like Travis Scott type vocal that I'm like want it to be spacey and like aggressive, but you don't just want to hear distortion all the time. I most likely will find myself using some type of distortion or saturation before the reverb on the aux to like bring the distorted sound into it and then blend that in.
yeah.
Um, Outside of that, I don't find myself saturating effects after the effect often, but before it, yeah, sometimes I like the vocal will be pretty clean, and then I'll send a very messed up signal into the reverb to get a different sound.
Okay. So for the listeners listening, if you were to, let's say, you were going to add some um, saturation on an 808, what would be your process of doing so? If it, let's just use 808, or we can use anything as an example. I just said 808 because it was in my head, but
No, sure. I mean, first of all, I would listen and see if it does need it. A lot of times, especially, a lot of times we're getting these sound selections that I see a lot of people use mixing techniques that they learned from like when we used to do a lot of recording and all these things, and everything used to be very dry, onto these signals that we're getting now, which are like super compressed and saturated and have all these things first. So I would say the first thing, which is, I know it's not your question, but the most important thing is listen to it and only put it on there if it needs it. If it doesn't, leave it alone. It'll probably sound way better at the end. If it does, on something like an 808, or even on something like an 808 where it's individual, I would most likely make sure I'm not affecting it without listening to the drums, because I don't want to lose the balance between it. But then I'll probably just throw it right on the track. I don't think I would do too much parallel like saturation or distortion with the 808. I would probably do a very low amount of it so that I'm not changing the sound of the 808, but it's just like cutting through a little bit more on the individual track. If, or maybe something that I'll do, if I do use it in parallel, if I feel like the 808 is too in the center, I'll do in parallel and I'll really distort it at least a good bit, and then I'll also widen it out, and then I'll blend that in a little bit by like also taking out some of the low frequencies, and they'll give, I don't feel like the 808 always has to be perfectly centered, so I like if it's a little bit on the
yeah,
sides. So I'll do that every once in a while. With
especially more
drums,
modern
if
day music.
yeah, no, for
Especially more
sure.
in modern day music, because back in the day it was like you always mono the bass.
Yeah, and then I
It's
do
very traditional.
somehow, and even if I find myself monoing out a lot of low end stuff later down in the mix bus, I still feel like bringing it a little bit out so that it's affecting higher harmonics and stuff in the earlier
Yeah,
in the chain still helps. Um, and then if I was to like affect it on drums, I would not do it individually. Most likely, I would probably do it on like a drum bus or like a drum group, so that I'm affecting all of them cohesively. That usually gives you a better sound, in my opinion. And yeah, if I do any saturation on vocals, it's most likely in parallel with like a decapitator blend in like very tiny bit, or
yeah.
I use Spectre a lot, which I guess that counts as saturation and EQ.
I love Spectre, Waves Factory
Yeah, I feel like
Spectre.
that's anytime that I feel like I'm EQing something and it's not cutting through enough, I'll do the same exact thing with Spectre, and it usually just sounds better. It cuts through a little bit more. Uh,
Yeah,
I like that I can't cut anything. It's a lot easier for me to cut things, especially, I don't know, it's also a little bit more correct. When I get into a mix, I try not to boost too much. I try to get the sound that I want by cutting things first. Um, but if I do want to boost something, sometimes instead of like cutting and boosting in an EQ, I'll cut and then I'll do the same boost I was gonna do in Spectre right after, and it usually gives it a pretty cool sound. So yeah,
amazing. That's such great techniques that you're doing. The listeners are going to love that, to
sure,
hear all those small little techniques that you're doing to create kind of a sound. When
yeah.
it comes down to then like obviously adding saturation, and not even just adding saturation, but just adding, I guess, things. I know you touched upon, you tend to cut with EQ more so than adding. What is your kind of reason for that? Is that because if you keep adding, you're going to create a muddy mix? Like,
I
what is
mean,
your
also
reason?
phase is important. People don't
Yeah,
necessarily look into phase as much, and I didn't either up until like a year ago or even like 6 months ago. So when I really started like being very careful about it, and at the same if you don't understand phase, we're not going to speak about it for an hour on here. I think everybody will fall asleep. But it is important to understand every time you boost, if you cut as well, but every time you use an EQ, you're introducing phase into your signal. So a lot of times, if you boost and cut in the same spot, you're introducing more phase. There's different ways that you can approach it in order to get a more, I don't know, more pleasing sound. Maybe a lot of times it's also important to understand that like if you can't hear it, it's fine. So I do like everything that I say, I end up actually doing the opposite of like 50% of the time. So keep that in mind and try to just understand like the ideology behind it. But in general, phase is the main reason why I would possibly like cut first and then enhance a couple things later instead of like boosting and cutting a bunch of things in one EQ. Um, and yeah, it's also just uh, I don't know. It also just gives me a more. Whenever you boost a bunch of stuff, creating you're masking certain things. Whenever you cut, I feel like you can just get rid of the masking first and then enhance it later if you need it. And we're also, I mean, if we are talking about saturation, whenever you end up saturating things farther down in the, if you are to put a fat filter Saturn 2 on the mix bus, you're gonna end up kind of turning everything up at the end of the day. Like you're boosting harmonics while you're up, things are getting turned up. So if you were already boosting everything way above, the mix is just not really I don't know. At that point, like I feel like the mix bus is controlling your entire mix. Instead, if you like cut and really get things where you want them, and then you can have more control over what you're enhancing.
So are you mixing into your mix bus? So you're starting with your mix bus and mixing into it, or do
So
you
I
put it
actually
on?
mix with nothing. Like I have a template and it has nothing on it besides like buses and routing. That's all I start
Yeah.
with. So every time I open it, there's not a single plugin that comes up. I know there's a lot of templates out there and a lot of mixing recording templates that have like all types of um, plugins and things already set up for you. And I think if that works for you, cool. I find that when I use it, all my mixes end up sounding exactly the same. And even if it's faster and like from a business point of view, that might be better. I personally don't like doing it. If I was, the reason why I like mixing is because I like mixing. So if I'm gonna mix, I'd rather just start from blank and approach the mix how I should instead of like being business smart about it. So
It's
yeah,
great
my
because it shows that
template,
you care about the mix. You
yeah, I
care about
really
the
do.
music
And
that you're
I think it
working.
like, even if it might end up taking you an extra hour to knock out a mix later down the line, I think it's long term wise, it's definitely helpful. Um, but yeah, what was I? Oh yeah, so all I have is literally just like buses and routing set up, and I import all my tracks. I send them wherever they have to go because I think like color coding and all this stuff is very important for my workflow. But besides that, yeah. So when I hit play, nothing plays. I'll usually listen to the reference. I feel like I'm definitely adjusting individual stuff first.
So
And
balancing.
yeah, I'm definitely
Yeah.
like balancing, panning if needed, subtractive EQ on a couple of things, not too much. I see people cutting like every single frequency. That's makes no sense at all. Don't do
Yeah,
that.
just turn it down.
Yeah, just that makes no sense. But yeah, so I'll subtract a little bit, and then maybe like once I have everything in, it's when I definitely won't affect my mix bus if everything isn't playing. But that's when I'll start adding like a couple things on my mix bus, stuff like that. And that's
And is
obviously
that how you
totally
get your
different
gain
if
staging?
yeah, gain staging is probably like the first thing I do. And then
Yeah.
that's obviously like the complete opposite. If I'm getting a Pro Tools session in, then I'm literally like looking at their routing, looking at their things, and most likely they're gonna have stuff on the mix bus already. And I'm unless I really feel like it's doing something I don't like, I'll most likely leave it on, or maybe I'll bypass it, see what it's doing, and try to recreate it. But that's risky. So yeah, if I'm getting someone's Pro Tools session in, I'll most likely get the routing set up to where I can understand it as well. But then I hit play and I mix with everything in all the time.
So you don't start a new session, import their wet
No,
stems, or
yeah,
you just go
that's
from their project.
yeah. If someone send you
Yeah.
their Pro Tools session, and I mean, obviously, also have like a conversation with the artist. Sometimes they might just work in Pro Tools, but they still don't like the session that they have. So at that point, you can really do whatever you want. But I find that usually, if you're getting, I mean, in general, actually, if you're getting stems or a session, just have a conversation with the artist and know how much they want you to mix this and how much they want you to just like enhance their mix. A lot of times, if a Pro Tools session you can see is very elaborated and has a lot of routing and stuff, they probably don't want you to change a bunch of stuff. So at that point, I would leave everything in.
And if someone wanted to send you a track to mix, would you? Obviously, it would be a communication, and you'd have to talk
Sure.
about it beforehand. But would it be? Would you be wanting wet stems, dry stems? As a different mixers want different things. So
Yeah.
what do you tend to go
If
for
you have
yourself?
the Pro Tools session, send me the Pro Tools session. Like literally, last time you saw it needs to be the first time I saw it. That would be perfect. That's usually
Love
not the case.
it.
So if you're just sending me stems and stuff, I always ask for the B stems to be fully wet. Don't take any, and I'll have a conversation with the artist or the producer or whatever. I'll be like, yo, send me the B stems completely wet, unless there's something that you were trying to do that you really don't like, but you were trying to go for something. Then send me the wet and the dry, and let's figure out how we can do it. I'll do that. Vocals, I'll ask for wet and dry, but usually, I mean, I'll just end up recreating stuff they had on vocals. Is usually not hard, so I'll just go ahead and do it with the work with the dry signal if I can, depending on the song. Like if it's a very elaborate song or if it's a bigger artist that really has their sound dialed in, I'll try to get the dry vocal and get like each stem for the wet
Effect
stuff
stem.
individually. Like I love getting like reverb prints. I think that's really cool to work with, even if it doesn't
Makes our
happen
life
often.
easy, doesn't it, as mixers? As long as the
Yeah, and I
reverb's
can
good, you
like
can just
blend in
put it
my
in.
reverb with theirs. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's yeah, in general, I like doing that. But yeah,
fantastic.
usually definitely like don't take anything off your beat stems. Don't like, even if you have stuff on the master while the artist was listening to the beat, don't take it off because the beat stems are gonna sound different. And then yeah, vocals is just like It just depends, man. It's kind of a mess right now. So whatever the
So
artist has, I'll work with, honestly. But that would be ideal.
especially if they're like not great recorded vocals, or you got to
Yeah,
do a lot of work on vocals that haven't been recorded well, or if they have been recorded well, then it's nice and easy.
sure.
But so you mentioned about the saturation, and when you add stuff to it, and you add stuff to mixes, and you tend to do a lot of kind of subtractive EQ instead of additive. I know we briefly mentioned about gain staging, but I know a lot of the
Hmm.
listeners, they always get confused about gain staging. They always want to know.
Sure.
Personally, I have a mix bus, and I know that if I hit my mix bus at a certain level, all of my plugins on my mix bus are going to be working to how I want them. It will change
Yeah.
it occasionally. So is there a way, you're a mixer yourself, is there a way that you treat gain staging when you get a mix in? Is there something that you're looking
Yeah, so
for?
I do have a way, and I think if I explain it to you, it won't help anyone. So I think what really
Okay.
helps people, well,
Yeah.
I think what really helps people is like, if I asked you right now to define 0 dB, people are always talking about dBs, and dB really means nothing. It's just a unit. Like, there's so many different forms of dBs. You need to actually understand what you're looking at. So if I tell you to hit something at -6 dB, that could mean a lot of different things. 6
Yeah.
dB full scale, 6 dB, like there's a complete different thing. So I think you really need to understand what 0 means. You need to understand that if you calibrate a VU meter to -14, whenever it hits 0, you're sitting at a certain level. If you understand that, and you can understand that whenever you go past digital 0 and dB full scales, you're clipping, and you can stay 6 dB full scales below that, or 6 to 10 usually, that's going to help you a lot more than just explaining to you exactly how I do it. Usually I will say I'll give myself not less than 6 dB full scale of headroom going into my mix bus.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm -10. I tend to aim for around
okay,
minus
yeah, and
10.
honestly, yeah, now that I think about it, that's probably where I start at. And I feel like a lot of times if I am getting louder as I mix, then I might end up having less than that. But definitely just
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
clip digitally. I don't understand why the point of that is at all. Yeah.
I don't know if you find this, but I always find when producers send me stuff to mix, everything is just so loud, and I
Yeah.
clip gain every single,
Yeah.
track in Pro Tools like -8 dB, and I'm like, oh, I could just stick a
Yeah, and I
limiter
mean,
on
I
the
guess
end,
if it's just like a normalization issue, then sure, we're not really changing anything. But yeah,
Yeah.
just there was a point. There's a reason why we clip in analog. There's no point at all to clip in digital. And anyone that tells you that it's for a specific sound, I don't know. I'm skeptical about it. If you guys, I mean, so there's no right or wrong to music, but definitely just try to look a little bit deeper into it before you just start clipping things. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So in your mixing, so you say you're mainly I know you do a lot of different genres, but you're mainly doing a lot of hip hop at the moment.
sure.
And I know you mentioned about different techniques. Is there any other things that every genre is different, and I think as a mixer you kind of have to understand what genre you're mixing to how you're going to approach the
Yeah.
mix. And it was really interesting that you said about that you don't really use mixing templates because you like to approach the song as a mix. You're enjoying mixing. You're not just looking at it from a business perspective, right? Let's just bang this mix out in 5 minutes, get paid, instead of spending
Sure.
a few hours. So in your mindset then, if you are having different genres, day in, day out of different ways of mixing, obviously it's still you mixing it, but can you expand more on different methods that you would apply to, let's say, a pop track over a hip hop track? Are there different things that you're mainly focusing on within the mix
Yeah.
sonically?
So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, keep going. Oh, you got it.
Yeah, that was basically the question.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think
I kind
every
of got lost in
genre,
my own question. Then I was like,
yeah, I think
going on and on.
every
But yeah,
genre is
go
gonna
on.
have its every genre is gonna have its own like fundamental things that need to be really sticking out of a mix. And I think it's important to understand what those things are by maybe listening to like older records in that genre. That can be helpful, but and also modern. At the same time, I think it's very important to understand that like every single record is different, and that's why I don't use any templates, because something that I do on one mix in hip hop could still not work at all for another mix that I do again in hip hop. And if I do one mix in hip hop and I do the same thing to a pop record, then it definitely couldn't work. And I just did a live album, for example. It's the first time that I mixed an entire live performance. And if I would have done those same things that I do to a regular mix that is being recorded in a studio environment to a live performance, nothing would have sounded cohesive. So just having a blank state of like pulling up the template and there's not a single plugin on there really helps me out, because I literally just hit play, I'll listen to the reference, and then I can like I'll do one thing at a time. I'll hit play. If I hear something, I go to it, I do it. My attention at that point will focus on something else. I'll go do that. And then by the time I'm done with that, I'm thinking about something. So I go affect that track. And I literally just do that. Like I try to just use my ears, and whatever I hear, I go and do it. If I feel like something is too muddy, I'll undo that. If something's too needs to add something, I'll go ahead and do it. I don't have any like set rules of like, okay, let me get the drums and get them at this level and then add distortion to them and then blend the 808 in and then the instrument and then the vocal. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I think even especially if you're like me and you're not even like well versed in the history of a lot of genres, I think just like being able to have a lot of songs that you worked on already, first of all, because that helps, and then just hearing all the raw tracks that they have and how the best way you can approach it and just do one thing at a time. I think that's the best way to approach any genre.
Are you
and to also
approaching
at
a
times
different instrument every time? So like a lot of traditional mixers that I've spoken to, they'll always say, I always start with the beat first, and then they build it up like a house, then vocal. I personally always start with the vocal. That's me. But do you have a
Sure.
way
Yeah.
that
And I
you're
mean, that's,
starting?
I think I used to do that. I think I used to be like, okay, let me get all the drums and then I'll blend in the bass and then I'll probably get the instruments in a little bit and then the vocals. And that's probably just because I used to produce and that's how I used to do it probably. Like the
Yeah.
vocals used to be the last thing in. So that's how I do it. And then I started to realize that whenever the artist, I try to honestly, what helps the most, I think, is if you can get into the mindset of the producer or the artist when they were making a record, that's going to help you more than anything else in mixing. Because when you think about it, when the artist sat in the room and they heard the beat for the first time, they didn't just hear the drums first and then the beat first and then the instruments and then they blend in the vocals. They probably heard something and the first thing they heard is a melody or a lyric or something that they wanted to put on top of it. So their vocals are probably very important. So I would say if you get a mix and it sounds like the drums are very prominent in the reference and all these things, and the vocals are just kind of like carrying the song along, but they're not super important, maybe do start with the beat first. If you get a song and it's like very spacey and acoustic, and there's a guitar and a vocal, and there are drums, the drums probably aren't as important as the guitar and the vocal. So at that point, I would try to get like the best balance between the vocal and the drum and the guitar, and then I would see like, okay, where do these drums fit in the song? So I think getting an understanding of like what the producer and the artist were going for when they were when they were making the song and approaching the mix in the same way they would have during that production process is probably the best way to do it. And then the best way to finish off the mix is probably to like break all that shit back down and redo it. Like if you listen to all the vocal and then everything is done, like, okay, now what happens if I mute the fucking guitar? How do the drums sound with the vocal? Okay, maybe I can adjust it to where when I bring the guitar back in, it sounds even better than it did before. So yeah,
What you said
I
there was
feel like,
amazing. Listen to what the producer was doing when they created
yeah.
the track to then
Yeah, I
enhance
mean, like,
in the mix.
it's important to understand. I think there's two different ways to go about it, because I do think we're going in a direction to where, like, if you get a Pro Tools session with a lot of producers are very good engineers, at least like the bigger ones. So if you get a Pro Tools session and it's like sounds pretty good already, and they open it, and you open the session, you do a couple things, you send it back to them, it's like a little bit better, and they get it approved immediately. Yeah, that's good for you, but like I don't feel like you really mixed the record. You kind of just went along and like finished it off, which is cool, but to me that's not really the point of mixing.
Yeah.
And in some situations you need to understand when you do have to do that, because it is important. Sometimes all you have to do is the last 5%. At the same time, I think it's also important to understand that like there are situations to where if the producer and the artist already had the mix, you wouldn't be mixing it. So try to like see how creatively you can go into it and
Would you say you have a
enhance it in a
sound then?
different way.
Would you say, when an artist or a producer sends you a track to mix, would you say that, you have a sound as a mixer that that you've mixed that record because it sounds like that in a certain way, or do you mix quite general, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I don't think I do, honestly. I honestly, that would probably be a better question to ask, like, to an artist that I've worked with a lot, to see if there's something specific that they come to me for. But at least I
Yeah.
try to like pride myself in the fact that like you come to me and like I'll do whatever the record needs. It's not so much about, at the end of the day, anybody who hears the record is not gonna care about who mixed it, most likely, other than other engineers. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely just try to do what's best for the record. But yeah.
Amazing. And as you mentioned earlier that you've come from a production background, that you were producing before, you were doing mixing full time.
Sure.
Do you find then that when you are getting mixes coming in, are you are you finding that you're spending a lot of your time attention to the production because maybe as a producer yourself with your experience, the person that you're mixing may not have the experience in production that you have, and therefore you
Uh,
start changing their drums
to a
or just
certain to a
yeah,
certain point, I think it's also the reason why I like mixing. I'm also realistic, and I think I'm a lot better at mixing than produce. I also like it a lot more, so I've spent a lot more time doing it now. But I guess production was always like how I got into music, but I don't know. I guess I didn't know that I had other options, but it wasn't really for me when I really go back and think about it. Like I was making a bunch of beats a day and sending them off every day, and some might get plays, but I don't know. It just wasn't for me. I like the idea of producing in a room with an artist a lot. Like if there's even now that I'm not producing a lot, if we're in a room and like we're done doing whatever the artist wanted, they want to do something from scratch, I'm down to like start producing with them in the room and everything. That's cool to me. Sitting in my
yeah.
room making beats and sending them off is just not really my thing anymore. So, um, and I
But
also think
because you've
there's
done
way
that, do you find when you get other jobs coming in for mixing only, do you feel like you're ever doing any production within the mixing? Because
Yeah, I mean, I think it all ties in
yeah,
together. Like even
yeah,
I'm also mastering pretty much like I would say 90% of the records that I'm mixing. And I think the way I approach a master is probably from everything I've learned in mixing. So everything I learned from mixing is probably
yeah, all
comes
goes
from
hand in
like
hand.
producing and recording. Yeah. So I definitely it all ties in, but I probably try to keep my opinion out of it depending on the situation, especially if it's a good producer. I like the idea of like, yo, you're the producer. I like trusting
Let
you
them
on
do
this. Let's go
it.
with
Yeah.
yeah, let me get in my mixing mindset.
And you mentioned about the mastering that you're mastering your own mixes. Are you
Sure.
approaching your mastering in a separate session to your mixing, or are you doing it all on the mix bus? And if so, is your mastering being changed during the mix if you're doing it both at the same time? Or
Yeah, so
I don't know. Yeah.
I give a lot of respect to mastering engineers, and there's yeah, I think it's mastering is a whole art of its own, and I've talked to a couple of very cool mastering engineers, and I give full props to them. So I don't consider myself a mastering engineer, but at the same time, I know for a fact that the people that I work with are coming to they might not even fully understand like the whole point of like mixing, mastering, getting it delivered, all this stuff. They expect to like come to me and they're like, "Yo, once you send me this record back, I want to be able to release it." So
I get
that's
that
why I'm
too.
yeah.
All
So
the
that's
time it happens.
and when I'm working with like bigger artists, it's a little bit different. Or right now, I can't say the project, but I'm working on a project. It's probably one of the first times with a bigger artist to where I'm just mastering. I'm not doing any of the mixing, and at that point, I'm approaching it completely differently. But yeah, so I don't consider myself a mastering engineer, but I know for a fact that when you reach out to me and I know that I can get the record to a loudness level and to like a overall quality level to where it can be delivered and it can compete just fine against mainstream records. And at the end of the day, that is kind of the point of mastering. So that's how I approach the master. Honestly, it's like well, if we're asking more of a technical, honestly, I do end up finding myself that like at the end of my mix bus, if I just like get the loudness up there, that's it for the master. I don't feel the need to like bounce it out without the limiter and go into a
Yeah.
mastering session.
Clipper and a
Um,
limiter.
yeah, I mean, if it's yeah, it's
Yeah.
I'm also not a huge fan of like getting things super loud. Excuse me, I do it way more than I want to just because everybody wants their stuff super loud. But honestly, if you look at even like the way things translates to streaming, if you turn in a record at a quieter level, it does usually end up sounding better. I had a interview with on my channel with Depp from Million Dollar Snare. He's an amazing mastering engineer. Um, and he talked about mastering the box for Roddy Rich. And he said it was like a -10 LUFS, which he said is usually quieter than what he's going for. But the record sounds
Yeah.
fucking amazing on streaming. So I do think if we could approach records a little bit quieter and the
It'd be
artist would
nice,
like
wouldn't it?
trust that it will sound better once it gets to streaming, it would
Yeah.
we all
I mean,
will benefit from it.
some of the records I work on, it's like they want like -8 or -6, and I'm like,
Oh
you could
yeah, no,
just
I'm
see the
going to like
limiter just squash, and I'm like, it's gonna add distortion.
yeah.
Let's
And I
not.
definitely do a lot of like I think clipping definitely helps a lot. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm not getting a lot of loudness with limiters anymore just because I feel like it completely destroys the record, honestly. But um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm also like my short term LUFS on the louder parts of the song. Sometimes it's like going above -6 and stuff, and I'm just not a fan of it.
Are
But
you measuring in short term in general? Or are you doing long term?
yeah, honestly, I don't even. I'm not
Very
too worried
technical.
about. I know like integrated levels are important. I'm not too worried about it because whenever they do send it out to delivery, all streaming platforms are gonna do their own normalization anyways. So my loudness reference is usually like, okay, let me make sure I'm not quieter than the reference because then they're gonna like the reference more. And then let me make sure that I'm like in a general balance of where the genre is at. But I'm honestly not looking at like the whole integrated level before I
You're
send
looking
off a
at
mix.
short term in general.
Yeah, I'll listen
Yeah.
to like the short term while like when I do have the limiter and I like pull it up just a little bit to get a little bit more loudness. I'll look at around where I'm at, and as long as it's not saying like -14 or it's not saying
Yeah.
-3,
Yeah.
I'm okay. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not listening to numbers too. I have a pretty good uh I think I've developed a pretty good idea of like just by I don't move my like volume knob all the time when I'm mixing, so I do sometimes but not constantly. So I have a pretty good idea of like where things just sound at
And I think
by the
as
time
well,
I'm
it's
done mixing.
having the understanding and experience of, if you're
Yeah,
doing hip hop and you've got more low end than you would do in a pop record, you're not going to be able to get it as loud in general, just because more
yeah,
low end
sure.
means less loudness. So it's understanding that, the experience of, how far can you push it, but also, do you actually want to push it that far to squeeze it, or do you want it
Yeah,
just to let the record breathe? So, that's something to be said. So
yeah.
you know when you're talking about kind of the mastering side, then regards to your mix bus, I know you mentioned that you change, like for me, I kind of change my mix bus like every like 6 months, let's say. Do
Sure.
you are you changing your mix bus literally all the time as well, or is it?
I wouldn't say I'm changing like the entire mix bus, but there's
Yeah.
definitely different inserts and like different parameters of it that do get changed every single time. Yeah, I don't do anything analog as of right now. Like I'm fully in the box. I
Yeah,
have the interest
it's the
of
way to
like,
go.
yeah, I do have the interest of going with one like analog piece. I've been looking at a couple of things and I just want to, I've been trying, I probably won't end up doing it for a minute, but I do like
Yeah.
the idea of like getting something that you just send off and you don't touch it. And because I do work with a lot of analog equipment like day to day, and I do think it sounds really cool. So I do have the idea of it, but no, I would say my
Yeah.
mix bus, in general, yeah, I think it's changing like 50% of the times, honestly, in some type of way. Like, especially if I'm looking at like, I don't know, I might add something, I might not add something. I feel like the plugins are always pretty similar. It's like I definitely have like some type of EQ, compression, then saturation, clipping, limiting. I feel like that's a basic mix
Yeah.
bus chain that I do, but I do think things are getting moved around based on the record, and then definitely like the way I use each step is completely different record to record.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, depending on the genre of the record, that will dramatically
Yeah,
change that as well.
sure.
You should check out the DW Fern, the VEQ or whatever it is. I've been told that that's incredible on the mix bus. I'm still yet to try
Yeah, no,
one,
I
but if
haven't
you are
checked it
looking at
out.
analog, you should
Cool.
check that one out. So um, let's talk about last kind of part of it. If we can talk about the you know plugins, there are so many plugins out there. I know you
Yeah,
mentioned a few during this podcast about some plugins, but I know
sure.
that the listeners always want to know, what plugins is he using, what plugins are they, and there is so many out there. So, do you have a group of plugins that you are using all the time, and that you would say that if you didn't have them, you would struggle to get your mixing to where it is now?
So yes and no. I do have plugins that I use all the time. I don't have plugins that like if I didn't have this, my mix wouldn't get to where it is. I think that's the most like I don't
Yeah,
know. I think people have this very weird idea of like you need a certain plugin to like
that's why I
get
wanted to
to do
touch upon
certain
it
things and mixing.
because
Yeah,
it's
no,
not
you should
true.
literally if you can't get your mix to sound as good with the plugins that you are using, like you should be able next time if anyone's listening, like next time you do a mix the whole song not using anything other than stock plugins. And if your mix doesn't sound as good as it did with the plugins that you're used to using, you're doing something wrong. You're relying too much on the plugins. You're not really relying on like what you're hearing. And then what that's gonna happen is like once you get a record that you are not as comfortable with doing, like for example, I am mostly doing hip hop rap. I got this like very alternative pop weird song that I got to work on a couple months ago, and I loved it, but it was like nothing like I had ever worked on. It was like super soulful and stuff. Um, but I didn't really struggle with it. Like when I first started the reference, I was like, oh, I don't know how the hell to approach this mix. And then when I actually got into it, I was like, okay, I just do it how I always would. I'm just using my ears, and I know that the tools I have I can use in certain ways to achieve different sounds. And that's what your plugins should be. They should literally just be like tools that you use to get to the sound that you want to get to. Um, with that being said, like I'm using the same plugins on like most mixes, but again, I'm not doing it because I'm not using the black box, like I said earlier, over the Magma because it sounds better. I'm just using it because it's like doing a little bit different things for me, right? It has like the
Yeah.
air knob that I know how to use in certain scenarios.
Or it can
If you have
depend
like
what day it
the
is.
Yeah, I mean, if you have like the stock EQ7 in Pro Tools, I
Yeah.
don't think Fab Filter Pro Q3 sounds any better than that. I just use Pro Q3 on fucking everything because it's like super fast and I'm super
Yeah.
used to it. So I feel like anytime I use an EQ, I literally have it set up to where that opens up for me. But I'm not doing it because it's better than the stock EQ. I'm just doing it because that's what I'm used to using. So yeah, I think if you were able to uh, get, I think especially if you're a beginner, you should like really learn your stock plugins, and then you'll see that every time that you do upgrade to something, you'll be like, oh, I can actually use this in this way to get to a better sound. Um, but yeah, if you're really relying on plugins, I think that's a very short term like career that you're going for. That's risky. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good stuff that you're saying. I mean, talking about plugins and stuff. I mean, one thing I've noticed, especially with newer mixers, that that you hear their stuff, and I always find the reverb is either too much or they're using the wrong kind of reverb for the song and the sort of
Sure.
style. And last, I just wanted to touch upon that a little bit. Because you are doing so many different genres and stuff, are you changing your reverb plugin or reverbs a lot, or do you have like your go-tos that you just tend to go to that
Yeah, I
sound
have.
good?
If I'm
Reverb
getting a
is a whole
session
nother
with a
thing.
reverb, then like yeah, if I'm getting a Pro Tools session and it has the reverb on there, I'll 100% leave it. I probably won't change. Like I'll probably affect the parameters in it, but I won't change the actual plugin most times at
Yeah,
least. Um,
it's quite a big
I
part of
feel
the
like
sound,
everybody
isn't it?
uses it, but like Valhalla Vintage Verb is really good. It sounds
Yeah,
great. I feel like that's on a lot of mixes that I get and a lot of mixes that I send out. Um, Deverb in Pro Tools is totally fine. Like if you gotta use it, that's cool. I use a lot of like short reverbs. So even if on vocals I have my main, like usually I'll have it set up. This doesn't happen all the time, but a lot of times what will happen is I'll have a lead vocal reverb set up, a background vocal reverb set up, and a short reverb set up. And what I'm using is like the reverb from the lead and background vocals is pretty similar usually, but the timing and like EQ parameters are different so that they're not like clashing into each other, and I can give them a little bit of a different space. And then the short reverb is the same usually on all hook, like all lead and background vocals, but I'm usually blending it into where like you can't really hear it. And what I try to do is like I listen to the song and I try to like imagine the environment that the artist wanted to be in when recording it, and I'll try to recreate that environment with a short reverb, and then I'll blend it in just a little bit. And whenever like I turn it off, I want to make sure that like when I put the short reverb on, I don't want you to be able to hear it, but when I turn it off, I want it to feel like, all right, this artist doesn't feel like he's in the room he wanted to be in as
so you're
much as he
creating
does
like a
when the short
doubler
reverb is on.
effect, like a
Kind of.
short
Actually, I
reverb.
use a doubler on a lot of stuff, like
Yeah,
super blended in to where you can't really hear it, and I think it gives a little bit of depth. But yeah, the I use a short reverb a lot in order to
create ambience around the
in order to create like the space that the artist wants to be in, and I feel like very often that's plate reverbs sound pretty well for that. So like um either like a plate or a chamber or like just a very short room reverb, just something to where I can create the space that the artist wanted to be in. And then for lead and background vocals, something I do very often on reverb. If I do get a reverb plugin that is already on there, I like, at least I feel like reverbs to my ears sound a lot better when they are like musically timed with the tempo of the song. So I do that
Oh, you
very
calculate
often.
the pre-delay, do you, or the?
Yeah, I'll do like the pre-delay and the decay calculated based on the tempo of the song, and then once it usually ends up getting adjusted a little bit just because I don't want it to be exactly where it's at, but that's usually my starting point.
Yeah.
And that even happens like, yeah, that's different in mastering. Even like if I'm on my limiter attack and release, I'm usually timing to the tempo. I'm doing that with like a lot of stuff all over my mix, honestly.
Yeah. So do you find that
But
the
yeah,
type of reverb that you're using is plates, you're saying, or again that changes depending
yeah.
on song?
No, that definitely, the play I feel like is what I end up reaching for like 80% of the times on my short reverbs, at least as of right now. That's probably gonna be different, but as of right now, that's what it is. On like leads and stuff, it just depends because like if it's a hip hop record, I don't really want you to hear the reverb too much, so I might go for like a room or chamber or something like that. If it's anything where people are singing, usually like cool hall reverbs sound
Yeah.
good. So
Halls are very
it just
popular.
depends though. Yeah.
Especially for like big kind of ballads. You're like
Yeah, no,
lots of full
definitely.
reverbs and stuff.
For
So
sure.
to kind of bring this episode to an end, I have a question I ask everybody that comes onto the show. And the question
Cool.
is, what 3 things do you know now that you wish you knew when you started out?
Huh.
It's a big question.
Yeah. Are you able to like edit this podcast? Like, should I think of something fast, or I can sit here for a minute?
You can sit there for a minute. I'll edit it.
All right, cool. Man, actually, it's funny because I did an interview with. I was doing a couple of these on my channel, and then I just stopped doing them. But I did one with Shane Lance, who's an amazing producer and really cool guy. And I asked him a question at the end too. He was like, "Ah, shit," and he said it for like 10 minutes thinking
Sure,
about it.
everyone has the same reaction. Everybody I've
Yeah.
interviewed.
So 3 things that I know now that I didn't know when I started. First of all, actually, the first one we talked about, plugins are not important, like at all. So first thing I would say, figure out your plugins, what you have, and just learn how to use it. Plugins are, people think I'm lying when I say it, like plugins are truly not important. So
Yeah.
that's the first thing, 100%. Second of all, maybe it's not as much on a mixing tip, but like I at one point I actually didn't know if it was true that you can make a living just sitting in your room making music, and now I'm fully sure that it is. And I've literally, it's weird because like things have taken off pretty fast for me. So like a couple years ago, I'm only 21 years old now, but a couple years ago, like I don't even think I made a couple $100 from music, and now it's like I do this for a living. So it's,
Amazing.
that's the second thing. It's like if you truly, whenever you decide to like follow a music career, you're gonna have a lot of people, rightfully so, telling you that it's not the best idea. Like my parents definitely at first were like, "Yo,
Yeah.
you gotta understand that like if you do this, not a lot of people make money," and that's true. Like parents want the safer option, so I think that's super important to understand. Like nobody that tells you not to follow a music career is being not support. I think we get this idea of like someone tells you not to do it, they're not being supportive. They're truly being like smart. Like there are a lot safer options that you can take, but I do believe that if you truly love making music or mixing or whatever it is, and you're willing to really put the work in, just go forward one step at a time. Don't focus on the money at all, and you will be able to make a career off of it. That's one thing I
So
definitely
true.
didn't know that's paid off. Um, Now a third thing, damn, I should have saved that for last. That was probably the best one.
The third one's always hard.
Let me think.
It'll be worth the wait.
Man, I should have saved that as my last one. Let me think of like something.
When we stop the podcast, you're going to be like, oh, I should have said that one.
No, actually, so I don't know exactly. Okay, third thing, I don't know exactly how to elaborate on this, but it is a lot more important to understand concepts than it is to understand basic like audio things. So if you really want to have a long-term career in audio, at least in my opinion, if you can truly understand like the basics and the fundamentals of how audio, not just mixing or producing, like how audio works, I think that's gonna help you out a lot more in the long run. For example, we're seeing it now and I'm working in it a lot. I'm pretty much doing it. Dolby Atmos is like super industry standard at this point.
Yeah.
Like all major songs are getting also mixed in Atmos. What I'm seeing is that a lot of people that are maybe really good at producing or really good at mixing, but they don't have a true understanding of audio, they struggle to like go to the next format because like I don't know, you kind of like you learned how to run a DAW and you learned how to like program some drums and sure, but like you're not necessarily understanding how things are working inside of that. And then whenever the next new thing comes out, it's a lot harder for you to adapt. When I started getting introduced into Atmos, it took me like just a couple of hours of like, okay, what is this? There's different sound formats. Cool. It's 128 inputs and outputs and they get sent to it. Like it's not that hard to understand really. A lot of people really struggle with it. And it's because in my opinion, like you dive into it and you think like, okay, things like physics and like math and all these things don't really correlate into music, which truly is like all that music is made out of is all these things. But people obviously are like, oh, you don't really need to know that. Just focus on like mixing it, make it things sound good. And then it's like, okay, but when a new format comes out or when you get asked to mix for a movie instead of a song, can you really like adapt yourself and learn the format fast? If you only know how to run your DAW and do those things, probably not. So I think
Yeah.
the first thing I said is plugins are important. Second of all, if you truly love music, just keep your head down. Don't focus on the money. Work as hard as you can, and the money will come. You'll be able to make a career off of it. Third of all, really learn like fundamentals of how your whatever it is that you're working in works instead of just the specific thing that you're working in. Because then when the new format comes out or anything new comes out, you're just able to adapt and maintain a long-term career a lot faster, in my
Fantastic.
opinion.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. And can you give us your social handles, and how can any of the listeners book you to mix if they would like to?
Yeah, for sure. So you can pretty much find me on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, anything on EDG Mixing. I'm sure you'll put in the descriptions if there are descriptions, stuff like that.
Yeah.
My engineer's profile, if you want to put a link to that as well, again, it's EDG Mixing. You can reach out to me if you do feel like that you want to have a conversation before you book the record. DM me on Instagram. I'm pretty active. Yeah, we'll go from there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on. And yeah, thank you.
Sounds good, man. Thank you for having me.